When working in CSS positioning, we need HTML and CSS to work together. So the first step is the HTML side, and that's what I want to take a look at now. And what we're going to do is create a new HTML page. So I'll just go to File, New HTML Page, and within this page we have all the basic HTML tags. What I want to do is add some additional HTML tags to the page. Let me go ahead and save this first. And when I go to save it, because I have a project defined, it saves it to that folder automatically. So I'm going to name this HTML-div tags, and I'm going to use dashes between words as my standard throughout the course. As you can see, that's how your pages are set up. So anytime I save multiple words, there will be a dash between them. Now what I want to do is use this new page to demonstrate the div tag, because it's an important tag when we're working in CSS positioning. Within the coffee cup editor that I'm using as my HTML editor, there's a tab called Code. And when I click on that tab and go to this last icon up at the top for XHTML, that's the doc type I'm using, it gives me a listing of all of the HTML tags coded as XHTML. And what this does is allow me to drag those tags out onto the page so you don't have to watch me type them all. So what I'm going to do is use the div tag. That's one of the most important tags in CSS positioning. So I'm going to drag some of those tags out, and I'll drag 3 of them. So if you're using a different type of editor, what we want are 3 separate div tags. Now the first one is going to say this is div 1. The second one will say this is div 2 and div 3. So what I'm doing is creating multiple div tags on the page. So do this in whatever manner you like within your specific editor. I'll save the page, and now that I've saved the page, if we preview this, let's take a look at what happens. I'll go over to my local preview, and I'm going to use Firefox for this one. And you can see, each div is shown on its own separate line in the browser. How can that be? Well, that's what a div tag does. It places content into its own space. Because div 1 is the first item listed on the page, that becomes the first line within the browser itself. So we know that what a div tag does is place content in its own space or on its own separate line. What happens if I duplicate this? I'll just copy and paste it so we have a few more copies. I don't worry about the numbers here. I just want to show you what happens if I use a span tag instead. So I'm going to take a couple of these in the middle, and I'm going to convert them to a span tag instead of a div. You'll see span tags used quite often with CSS, but they're used in a particular way, and that's because of the properties built into the tag. So if I go over to Firefox again, notice my span tags. They're both on the same line. My div tags are not. So what does a div tag do? What a div tag does automatically within HTML is place content in its own line. What a span tag does in HTML is absolutely nothing. It's the only HTML tag that has no built-in properties. So that's why we tend to use a div tag when we're working in CSS positioning. We can surround content, and what this does is segregate that content out into its own space. So that is the difference between a span tag and a div tag. And the div tag is where we start all of our HTML pieces. Everything related to CSS positioning is usually done using the div tag. So that is what an HTML div tag does.